Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is going to be arguing about the semantics of macroevolution. Let's begin.
So, let's start by laying down some groundwork, beginning with definitions. What exactly is the difference between evolution, microevolution, and macroevolution? Well, within evolutionary biology, evolution is defined as biological change over generations, and it encompasses both micro and macroevolution. Microevolution is biological change over generations within a species, and macroevolution is biological change over generations outside of a species, and that is the only difference. They both rely on exactly the same mechanisms, that being genetic mutation and natural selection.
Now first, if I were to accept those definitions of microevolution and macroevolution and were to argue within those definitions, then he would be missing one, specifically biological change over generations outside of a kind, since that is the real issue. And the only method he states for evolution to happen is mutation and natural selection. But mutations and natural selection could never add information. Natural selection can only ever select from what is already in existence, and it selects it by removing the one it does not select. So natural selection will always reduce the amount of information, genetic information. Mutations as well do not add information. A newspaper article is a good example of this. If you were to scramble the letters around, or change one letter into a different letter, or copy the whole article, none of these examples would add information. For example, the sentence, "the dog runs." If you scrambled the letters and it still made a coherent sentence, say, "the God runs," you did not add information. All you did was change the current information. You lost the dog, so you still have the same amount of information. Now, treating this sentence as if it were DNA, if you add an S and get "the dogs runs," then you have an incoherent sentence, and natural selection would remove that sentence, bringing the sentence back to "the dog runs." If you make it "the dogs run," moving the S from one part of the sentence to another, you still have the same amount of information. And lastly, if you just copy the whole sentence and have "the dog runs," you had not added any information. The same information said twice is still the same information. You didn't learn anything new by saying "the dog runs" a second time.
But this raises the immediate and very important question: what's the definition of a species? A species is defined as a group of individuals that are able to produce viable, fertile offspring. And so, for example, the Chihuahua and the Great Dane are the same species because they can successfully interbreed, despite their anatomic differences. Whereas the Asian elephant and the African elephant are two separate species because they can't successfully interbreed, despite their anatomic similarities. Now, microevolution, that being biological change over generations within a species, is supported by overwhelming evidence, and it's accepted by almost everyone, including the most scientifically illiterate of creationists. Hell, even Kent Hovind accepts it.
Now that one happens. I think animals can produce a whole variety of offspring. Long hair, long-legged, short-legged. That happens.
But macroevolution, that being biological change over generations outside of a species, or speciation, is not accepted by creationists, despite the fact that it's also supported by overwhelming evidence. And so, before we move on, I'm going to present just two examples. The first is the greenish warbler, a ring species that's been generously covered by Holy Kool-Aid within one of my other videos. Evidently, this bird originated in the southern Himalayas and expanded over generations east and west around the mountains, and along the way they evolved, or adapted to their new environments. By the time they met up north of the mountains, however, they had evolved, or adapted, to such a degree that they could no longer successfully reproduce. They were, and are, by definition, a different species. And the second example that I'll give is cuddly rabbits. Just as humans have artificially bred a multitude of dogs, so too have they bred a multitude of rabbits. But while all dog breeds can successfully reproduce, the same can't be said of all rabbit breeds. Namely, the Alaska and Florida rabbit can't successfully reproduce. They can both reproduce with other breeds, but they can't reproduce with one another. They are, by definition, a different species. They are an example of macroevolution. Anyhow,
the birds are still birds, the dogs are still dogs, and the bunnies are still bunnies. There is a logical problem with his definition of species, but I think I'll save that for the next clip. In the meantime, what are the different species of human? Presumably there's only one species of human, because we can all produce viable, fertile offspring. But if evolution were true, then why is that? Why is there not a group of people that cannot produce fertile offspring with another group of people? And of course, saying they're different species does not prove evolution.
Anyhow, to get back on topic, with the evidence for speciation being overwhelming, the argument is over, no? I mean, surely, if we have overwhelming evidence of organisms adapting to such a degree that they no longer interbreed with one another, then macroevolution has been demonstrated, right? Well, the answer is yes. But here's where things get confusing. Those who assert that macroevolution cannot occur, such as Kent Hovind, Ray Comfort, and Ken Ham, define macroevolution not as biological change over generations outside of a species, but as biological change over generations outside of a kind. And they, like many creationists, changed the definition of the word kind arbitrarily, and in doing so, they commit an equivocation fallacy. And I'll show you an example of this now.
But you know, nobody has ever seen a dog produce a non-dog. Never. You may get a big dog or a little dog, but you're going to get a dog every time. And it could be that the dog, the wolf, and the coyote had a common ancestor. I wouldn't argue about that. They probably did. But every 5-year-old kid knows they're the same kind of animal.
Kind? What exactly do you mean by kind, Hovind? That they're all of the family Canidae? That they're all of the order Carnivora? That they're all of the class Mammalia? That they're all of the phylum Chordata? That they're all of the kingdom Animalia? That they've all got hair? That they've all got limbs? I mean, really? How are you defining the word kind? You're pulling this definition out of your...
See, if they can bring forth, they're the same kind. Simple definition. Can they bring forth? A dog and a wolf can mate and bring forth. A dog and a banana cannot.
Oh, I see. You're using the same definition for kind as biologists do for species. Great. But hang on a second. The Alaskan and Florida rabbit has adapted to the point that they can no longer interbreed. And so, according to your definition, macroevolution has occurred, right?
No, it's a variation and it's still a rabbit. That doesn't prove it came from a rock, folks.
What?
It could be that animals have diversified, like Alaska rabbits and Florida rabbits can no longer interbreed. Okay, but they're still obviously the same kind. They could originally interbreed.
And there you have it, folks. Hovind has switched his definition. He's playing tennis without the net. In the one breath he says,
if they can bring forth, they're the same kind. Simple definition.
But in the next breath he says,
Alaska rabbits and Florida rabbits can no longer interbreed. But they're still obviously the same kind.
And hence, Hovind, like many proponents of this argument, commits an equivocation fallacy, because he switches which definition of the word kind he's using arbitrarily.
No, he isn't. A kind is a group of organisms that is and always has been reproductively isolated. So you can tell if two animals can mate and produce offspring. And by the way, it doesn't even have to be fertile offspring to count. If they can produce any offspring, they are the same kind. And this is the fallacy I see a lot of evolutionists make. They assume that just because being able to reproduce makes them the same kind, that not being able to reproduce automatically disqualifies them from being the same kind. But this is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. If P, then Q. Not P, therefore not Q. An easy example to follow would be, if it is snowing, then it must be cold outside. It is not snowing, therefore it is not cold outside. Doesn't have to snow to be cold. If they can reproduce, they're the same kind. They cannot reproduce, therefore they're not the same kind. That is denying the antecedent. Now on to his definition of species, using his rabbits as an example. So if breed A is the same species as breed B, and breed B is the same species as breed C, and we know both of those are true because they can interbreed fertile offspring, then it would logically follow that breed A is the same species as breed C. But since breed A cannot breed with breed C, you call them different species. And here's where the real logical problem comes in. What do you call the species? So breed A and breed B are the same species because they can interbreed. Okay, that's species, let's say species X. And B and C can interbreed, therefore they must be the same species. And since breed B is species X, then breed C must also be species X. But breed A and breed C cannot reproduce, therefore they must be different species. But we've already confirmed that they are all species X. How do you rectify this? Leave your answer in the comments if you have one.
Furthermore, and to hammer home a point that Potholer54 has made in relation to this very subject, if Hovind's definition of kind includes speciation, then he accepts macroevolution outright, but he just insists that it's called adaptation, or as Potholer puts it himself,
Hovind thinks a species will change over time as it adapts to new environments, and that's what the theory of evolution says. Hovind thinks this is because of natural selection. Well, that's what the theory of evolution says. Hovind thinks this will produce a variety of new populations of animals that can no longer interbreed. Yes, that's what the theory of evolution says. Hovind calls this variation. The theory of evolution calls it evolution. And finally, Hovind says organisms change but always stay within their own kind. And the theory of evolution can at last agree, since a kind is now defined as an organism that shares a common ancestry.
So Mr. Rationality and Potholer54 are both unable to provide any evidence of one kind turning into another kind, so instead they pull a bait and switch and try to change the definition of kind to mean species. But of course, as I demonstrated earlier, their definition of species is a bit of a rubber ruler. While it is true that one kind of animal would have a common ancestor within its own kind, it would not share a common ancestor with any other kind of animal. But this bait and switch is intended to make you believe otherwise.
And finally, I want to very briefly take on another definition of macroevolution, though it's certainly less popular. That being an increase in genetic information. So first off, know that I plan to dedicate a whole video to this nonsense at a further date, but to quickly smash it out of the park. Most of the proponents of this assertion accept microevolution, that being biological change over generations within a species, and so they've already lost the argument. If organisms adapting to have longer limbs, larger brains, and resistance to diseases isn't an increase in genetic information, then I don't know what definition of information they're using.
How about the definition process, stored, or transmitted data? Let's start with longer legs. The legs in species A is set by its DNA to be 1 foot long at maturity. Its offspring loses that part of the DNA that controls how long the leg should be. So it ends up being 2 feet long. Because even though the DNA lost its limiter, there's still a limit within physics, and the legs are unable to take more material than they're given. For instance, not enough calcium to make the bones. And since all the bones would grow at the same time, at least at first, then the legs are not able to get a crazy amount of calcium to make bones that are 11 feet long. If the mutation that caused the 2 feet long legs ended up causing 11 foot long legs, there'd be basically no bones in the rest of the body, and that genetic mutation would be lost. This is not adding genetic information. It's the same information, just with less restraint. Next is bigger brains. This one sounds like begging the question. Which animal adapted a bigger brain within the same species? Of course, he doesn't clarify, he just asserts it. And resistance to diseases is a classic example of losing information, much in the same way that losing both your arms makes you immune to handcuffs. or losing your hands makes you immune to handcuffs. Losing certain genetic information will make you immune to certain pathogens. An example of additional information would be one kind of animal gaining the trait of another kind of animal, such as a bunny growing wings, little furry wings. They may not help the bunny survive, but no mutation would. For example, in order to fly, the bunny would need wings, feathers, and hollow bones. The hollow bones would not help the bunny survive, as the bones would be easily broken, and with bones that weak, the bunny would not be able to run fast enough to escape its predators. Feathers are no better than fur unless you're using them to fly, which, if feathers came first, the bunny would not be flying. So all three of these mutations would be required to make a bunny fly, and until all three of them exist at the same time, they are not beneficial. But they would be new information. Well, the feathers and wings would be. Hollow bones would probably be a lack of information. And by wings, I mean fully formed wings, with bones that are able to flap. Anything before that I could just classify as a tumor.
The truth of the matter is that the mechanisms that cause microevolution and macroevolution are exactly the same. And hence, to believe in microevolution but not macroevolution is to believe in inches but not feet, seconds but not minutes, or microaging but not macroaging. It is utterly devoid of sense.
And to close out the video, we have the fallacy of a false analogy. There is no such word as microaging and macroaging. That is actually no different than his seconds but not minutes analogy, since they would both be units of time. But his analogy is false because inches and feet are units of measurement, and seconds and minutes are units of measurement. They measure time. Inches and feet measure distance. Microevolution and macroevolution do not measure anything. They are events that may or may not happen. And to say if you believe in microevolution means you should believe in macroevolution would be affirming the consequent. If macroevolution, then microevolution. Microevolution, therefore macroevolution. That is very fallacious reasoning, which I explained in an earlier video.